Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending our half-day conference on the British legacy in Palestine, Balfour and Beyond. My name is Mandy Turner, and I am the director of the Kenyon Institute, which is a British academic research centre based in Sheikh Jarrah, 5 minutes from where we're sitting today. I'm just going to say a few words to open the conference and to tell you the running order of the day. You were all given short programmes, so you can see who's speaking and when, and little biographies of the speakers. So I hope that this short introduction, I'm going to try and keep it short so that we can try to keep to time today. First of all, I want to thank our partners, the Educational Bookshop, and in particular Mahmoud Muna. We first started talking about this event over a year ago, and it seems astonishing how much work goes into putting something like this together. Working with Mahmoud is always a pleasure, particularly because he manages to keep his good humour and patience, never mind how stressful things become. So thank you, Mahmoud. I would also like to thank our more recent partners on this event, the British Council Palestine, who kindly provided us with the funds to make it all possible. I'll mention just two final thank yous. First, to the staff of the Palestine National Theatre for making it possible to have the event in such a wonderful space, so thank you to the staff. And secondly, to all the unpaid helpers who kindly offered to help Mahmoud and I when it became clear that the amount of people interested in this event was exceeding all our expectations. So thank you to Polly, Ahmad, Yara and Nora for helping out today. They've really helped reduce mine and Mahmoud's stress levels. If I've left anyone off the list, I apologise. And last but not least, I want to thank the speakers for agreeing to participate in this event. I hope that the discussions will be fruitful. If you want to tweet about it, I've been told that there's a hashtag Balfour100. We are also live streaming the event through the Educational Bookshop's Facebook site, and it has been recorded to go on social media afterwards. So please, can you switch off your mobile phones? We don't want to disturb either the speakers or the viewers outside, so please, can you close and switch them off now? There are also photographers roving. This is all for the Kenyon Institute and Educational Bookshop's use on our website and social media thereafter. But if you have a problem with this, please move to the back of the auditorium, up the steps to the back, and you will not be photographed or filmed. So please, if you wish to do that, please make your way there now. We have tried as much as possible to make the event accessible to our friends and colleagues from the West Bank and Gaza who cannot attend due to movement restrictions, permits, and the blockade. This is a situation whose origins lie in what we'll be discussing here today. However, we felt that it was significant that this conference was held in East Jerusalem, and we hope that you agree with us. Today marks 100 years since that fated day when Britain's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter to Lord Rothschild, who was then a leader of the British Jewish community, to declare that Britain viewed with favour the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Given that Britain captured Jerusalem 1 month later, occupied it, and was later awarded the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, this was a hugely significant letter and declaration that was to have enormous implications for the people of Palestine and the region as a whole. And in fact, the consequences of the Balfour Declaration have reverberated throughout the whole world and continue to this day. This conference will dissect the declaration and explore what was meant by it, as well as its historical legacy. Today, we have brought leading historians of the period to do that for us. The Educational Bookshop is selling many of their books today outside on the stall, so open your purse after you leave. Our keynote speaker, Professor Avi Shlaim, is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford in the UK. He is one of the world's leading historians of the period. Indeed, only 2 days ago, he told me he has been inundated with requests to speak about the Balfour Declaration. So we're extremely glad and grateful that he accepted our invitation to speak here today. We feel very privileged and honoured. Professor Shlaim is the author of The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, and many, many other studies. His keynote lecture today will address British policy from Palestine, from the Balfour Declaration to the current British Prime Minister Theresa May. And I've been assured by Professor Shlaim that he will not mince his words, so I'm looking forward to his address. After Professor Shlaim's keynote, which will last for 45 minutes, we will go straight to our first panel, which includes 3 leading historians of the Balfour Declaration. Professor Salim Tamari from the Institute for Palestine Studies here in Palestine, Dr. Roberto Mazza from the University of Limerick in Ireland, and Dr. Stephen Wagner from Brunel University in the UK. They will dissect what was meant by the Declaration and how to interpret it. I'm sure there'll be lots of disagreement between them on this, based on the principle that if you have 3 historians, there'll probably be 4 different perspectives. This session will be chaired by Professor Rima Hamami from Birzeit University in Palestine, who will be in charge of directing the discussion and debate. In fact, the format of the conference is designed to facilitate as much discussion and debate as possible. And so the panel contributions will be initially kept short to keep enough space for questions and comments from the audience. After the first panel, we will then break for coffee, which will be provided outside in the foyer, and we will return half an hour later for the second panel, which will explore the legacies of the Declaration. All of the speakers on the second panel have conducted extensive historical research on this. We have Dr. Rana Barakat from Birzeit University in Palestine, Dr. Jacob Norris from Sussex University in the UK, and Dr. Lauren Banco from the University of Manchester, also in the UK. This session will be chaired and directed by Raja Shahada, an independent writer from Palestine. At the start of each session, Mahmoud and I will alternate to introduce the speakers and then hand over control to the chair. Then Mahmoud and I and our helpers will be moving about the audience with microphones to help facilitate your involvement. Mahmoud will then close the conference with some short comments. We would like to ask you to keep your comments direct and your contributions short in order to allow as many people as possible to speak and for the debate to flow freely. And we would also like to request that we remain courteous at all times to each other, even when we disagree. This is a highly contentious subject, but we hope that today we can have some fruitful discussions and enlightening debate. I will now pass you over to Professor Shlaim for his keynote lecture. I apologize for not allowing a question and answer session after his speech, but we feel that the format of the roundtables will allow more direct engagement and greater debate. I hope you enjoy the event, and thank you for coming. Professor Shlaim.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking the Kenyan Institute, the British Council, and the Educational Bookshop for convening this conference on Britain's legacy in Palestine, and for inviting me to give the keynote address. The title of my talk is Britain and Palestine from Balfour to May. And the fundamental fact about the Balfour Declaration is that it was illegitimate. Daniel O'Connell, an Irish leader of the 18th century, once said that nothing is politically right which is morally wrong. The Balfour Declaration was morally wrong, and therefore it could not be politically right. Talleyrand, the French diplomat, said about the execution of a nobleman, "It's worse than a crime, It's a mistake. The Balfour Declaration was both a crime and a mistake. It was a crime against the Palestinian people, and it was a mistake from Britain's point of view, because it was like a millstone round Britain's neck until the very end of the mandate. And finally, there is an Arabic saying that something that starts crooked remains crooked. British policy towards Palestine in 1917 was crooked, and it remains crooked today. Last year was the anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This year is, of course, the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. Both documents are landmarks in the history of the modern Middle East. The difference is that Sykes-Picot was not implemented, whereas the Balfour Declaration was implemented. Both remain highly important at the symbolic level to this day. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is the symbol of the colonial carve-up of the Middle East in disregard for the rights and aspirations of the local people. And the Balfour Declaration is the symbol of a British imposition of a Zionist entity in the heartland of the Middle East. The Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration remain the main terms of reference for all Arab nationalists from then until today. The Balfour Declaration was only 67 words long, but it had the most far-reaching consequences for Jews, for Palestinians, and for the entire region. It started the process of the dispossession, dispersal, and exile of the Palestinians, which culminated in the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the Palestinian Nakba, or catastrophe. Today, I would like to focus on British imperialism, on Britain's record in Palestine over the last 100 years. The Zionist movement was Britain's junior ally in the dispossession of the Palestinians. Zionism was a settler colonial movement, and its principal political progeny, the State of Israel, is a colonial settler state. Noam Chomsky observed that settler colonialism is the most extreme and sadistic form of imperialism. The Palestinians had the great misfortune of being at the receiving end of both British imperialism and Zionist colonial, settler colonialism. Britain's moment in the Middle East, to use the title of Elizabeth Monroe's classic book, Britain's moment in the Middle East was brief, but its consequences for the Arabs were devastating. Britain denied the Arabs independence, freedom, and democracy. The hallmarks of British policy towards Palestine were deviousness, duplicity, and double standards. The French call Britain perfidious Albion, which is true, but the French are no less perfidious than the British. Perfidy and egotism are in the DNA of colonial powers. In the course of World War I, Britain made three famous promises which were incompatible with one another on the future of Palestine. Historians have dwelt endlessly on the texts, and I would just like here to mention briefly the context, which was that Britain was fighting a desperate world war, and it was desperate in search of allies, And in its search of allies, it made these three different commitments. The first promise in 1915 was to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca. The promise was made in the course of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And the promise was that if the Sharif of Mecca mounted an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain, at the end of the war, would support the establishment of an independent Arab kingdom under his rule. This was a very big ask of the Sharif, to ally with an infidel against his Muslim overlords, but he kept his side of the bargain. Later, there was a dispute, or at least Britain denied, that Palestine was included in the promise. The Sharif was convinced, for good reason, that he had been promised Palestine as part of the kingdom. But since Britain reneged on its promise of an independent Arab kingdom to the Sharif of Mecca, whether Palestine was included or not becomes a purely academic issue, and when I say academic, I mean futile. In 1916, Britain concluded the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was a secret agreement between Britain and France, an agreement to divide the Middle Eastern parts of the Ottoman Empire into a French and a British sphere of influence. The Allies couldn't agree on Palestine, so they compromised by placing Palestine under an independent international administration. In effect, it was to be a condominium. The Sykes-Picot Agreement flatly contradicted the promise to the Sharif of Mecca. But worse was to come, because in 1917, 100 years ago today exactly, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration. And Prime Minister Theresa May reminded us that the letter of Balfour to our Lord Rothschild is one of the most important letters in history. Theresa May, remember the name, I'll come back to her. The Balfour Declaration said, as you have just heard, that Her Majesty's government would view with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights or status of Jews anywhere. So Palestine became the twice promised land. First, it was promised to the Arabs, and then it was promised to the Zionists. Arthur Koestler, the Jewish writer, summed it up by saying that one nation, Britain, promised the land of another people to a third people. Britain had no moral or legal right to make this promise. The concept of a national home did not exist under international law. But for the Zionists and for the British policymakers, it was crystal clear from the beginning that a national home would be only the start of what would develop in time into a Jewish state. In 1917, the Arabs were 90% of the population, the Jews were just under 10% of the population, and the Jews owned 2% of the land. So this was a classic colonial document which totally disregarded the rights, the opinions, and the aspirations of the majority of the people who lived on this land. The big question is, what was Britain's motive in issuing this declaration? And here there are two broad schools of thought: the humanitarian school and the imperialist school. The humanitarian school says that this declaration was, this gesture was a noble project, a noble Christian Zionist project to enable an ancient people to return to its ancestral homeland. And the imperialist, so the motives were altruistic. The imperialist school says that the motives were self-seeking, they were selfish, and that they were the result of British imperial calculations, right or wrong, but the result of British imperial calculations. I haven't come across any convincing evidence to support the humanitarian version, so I'll put forward the imperialist interpretation of British motives, plus an element of anti-Semitism. And it should come as no surprise to you that anti-Semitism and pro-Zionism sometimes go hand in hand together. And it was no other than Theodor Herzl, the prophet of the Jewish state, who predicted that the anti-Semites will become our most loyal friends. Arthur Balfour himself may have been anti-Semitic. At any rate, he once met with Cosima Wagner in Bayreuth, and they discussed the Jews. Cosima Wagner was the wife of the composer, and she was even more anti-Semitic than her husband. And Balfour, by his own account, said he shared, quote, many of her anti-Semitic prejudices, unquote. In 1905, Balfour, as Prime Minister, introduced the Aliens Bill in order to prevent East European Jews who were facing persecution from finding refuge in Britain. This was the first major piece of anti-immigrant legislation in Britain, and this is a very burning issue in British politics today. Balfour realized, of course, that his declaration contradicted the principle of self-determination, but he didn't care. He had no intention of consulting the local population. In 1919, Balfour wrote to Lord Curzon, who had strongly opposed the Balfour Declaration in Cabinet, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and the prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Excuse me. So the Zionists had traditions, they had a past, they had present needs, they had future hopes, and the Arab majority had only desires and prejudices. Note the offensive language and the Olympian disdain with which Balfour treated the Arabs. Balfour also admitted in 19, quote, that so far as Palestine is concerned, The powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate. So there can hardly be a more conclusive proof of British duplicity and cynicism. But the real driving force behind the Balfour Declaration was not the Secretary of State, but Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was a Welsh radical, but in foreign policy he was an old-fashioned British imperialist and a land grabber. And he fell under the spell of the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann. During Lloyd George's premiership, Chaim Weizmann visited him at number 10 Downing Street 11 times. But geopolitical considerations remained paramount. Everything was subordinated to British imperial priorities. Lloyd George wanted Palestine in the British sphere of influence for two reasons. One was to exclude the French, and the other is because Palestine controlled the access to the Suez Canal and therefore the imperial routes of communications to the Far East. The generals said that they did not need Palestine, but Lloyd George had broader imperial considerations. The Israeli scholar from Haifa University, Daniel Gutwein, in an important article on the politics of the Balfour Declaration, said that the British government at the time was divided into two schools of thought on the future of the Ottoman Empire, the radical school and the reformist school. The radical school wanted to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and replace it with British client states, and the reformist school wanted to keep it as one unit, but to reform it. Lloyd George was the leader of the radical school, and when he became Prime Minister in December 1916, he pushed the radical agenda as hard as he could. Zionism fitted into this agenda, and Weizmann became his close ally. There seemed to be a convergence between the Zionist desire for a toehold in Palestine and Lloyd George's desire to incorporate Palestine in the British sphere of influence. According to this thinking, Palestine would become a British protectorate. Zionism would legitimize the British presence in Palestine. But Lloyd George miscalculated. He did not really need the Zionists. The Arab nationalists were a much more powerful instrument for dismantling the Ottoman Empire, and they were already Britain's allies. If the aim was to renege on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, then Lloyd George could do it with the willing cooperation of the Arabs. All he had to do is to honor the promise that McMahon had made to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca. The population of Palestine was predominantly Arab. The Zionist project was to bring European Jews to Palestine, and this was bound to provoke opposition. Moreover, Lloyd George knew that the majority of British Jews were opposed to the Zionists. So why did he privilege the Zionists? The answer, as suggested by Tom Segev in One Palestine Complete, is that he had a highly inflated idea of the international influence of the Jews. He often spoke of world Jewry or international Jewry as if it was a monolithic political force. His support for Zionism was based on the on a misperception. In aligning Britain with Zionism, he acted in the mistaken and perhaps anti-Semitic view that the Jews had subterranean power, that they made the wheels of history turn. More specifically, he relied on what he thought would be a predominant influence of the Jews in Russia and in the United States. The reality was that the Jews were an impotent minority with nothing to offer except the myth of international Jewish power, and the Zionists were a tiny minority within the Jewish minority. The great majority of influential English Jews were opposed to the nationalist idea inherent in Zionism. Sir Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, was the only Jewish member of the Lloyd George cabinet. And on the 23rd of August 1917, he submitted to the cabinet a 4-page memorandum under the heading, "The Anti-Semitism of the Present Government." In this document, he laid out the Jewish case against Zionism, and he proved to be very far-sighted. His premise was that Judaism is a religion, not a nation, and therefore it did not make sense to create a Jewish state. He argued that a Jewish state in Palestine would undermine the struggle for equal rights for Jews in Britain, in Europe, and everywhere else. And speaking in a personal note, he said, if there was a Jewish state in Palestine, it would make him an alien in his own country. He concluded that Zionism was, quote, "a mischievous political doctrine untenable by any patriotic citizen of the United Kingdom." But the cabinet voted for the Balfour Declaration. The first draft for the declaration had been submitted by Dr. Weizmann. There were many subsequent drafts. When the cabinet was discussing for the last time the Balfour Declaration, Dr. Weizmann was waiting in the antechamber, and when the decision had been taken, the cabinet secretary, Sir Mark Sykes, went out and announced the good news. He said, "Dr. Weizmann, it's a boy." The next landmark was the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. It was given to Britain at the San Remo Conference in 1920. And the Balfour Declaration had been written into the preamble to the mandate. So what had been a non-committal British promise to the Zionists became a binding international document. But apart from helping to create a national home for the Jews in Palestine, the mandate stated that Palestine was a sacred trust of civilization, and Britain had to prepare the country for independence. Preparing a country for independence means introducing democracy, but this Britain did not do, so it did not fulfill the terms of the mandate, the broader terms of the mandate. From the point of view of British interests, the Balfour Declaration was a colossal strategic blunder because it turned Palestinian and Arab and Muslim, it provoked the opposition and resistance of all these groups, resistance that continues to this day. And in the most recent speech by President Mahmoud Abbas, he spoke about the Balfour Declarations. I read his speech, I agreed with everything he said. It's very much along the critique that I'm putting forward to you today. As the mandatory power, Britain favored the Zionists. Sir Herbert Samuel, the first commissioner, High Commissioner, was both a Jew and an ardent Zionist. And I'm very pleased to see in the audience my friend Bernard Wasserstein, who is the distinguished biographer of Sir Herbert Samuel. The Palestinians demanded a democratically elected National Assembly and government. Whitehall rejected all their demands. Sir Martin Gilbert, who cannot be suspected of anti-Zionism, in a speech in the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, said the following: "The cornerstone of mandatory policy was to withhold representative institutions for as long as there was in Palestine an Arab majority," unquote. So this is the key to British policy, to prevent representative institutions until the Jews became the majority in Palestine. There was also an element of racism that colored Britain's approach to and conduct in Palestine. Let me quote from the evidence that Winston Churchill gave to the Peel Commission of Inquiry in 1937. This is what he said: "I do not agree that a dog in the manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or to the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come in and taken their place," unquote. So the Palestinians are a dog in the manger, but the Jews are a superior race and a higher grade race. The racist language is utterly shocking, but not surprising, because racism and imperialism often go hand in hand together. In 1936, an Arab revolt broke out. Britain crushed the Arab revolt with the utmost brutality. And Rashid Khalidi has argued, and I agree with Rashid Khalidi, that Palestine wasn't lost in the late 1940s, it was lost in the late 1930s because of the decisive manner in which Britain crushed Arab resistance to Zionism. This brings me to the 1948 war, and I'm not going to go over the debate between the old Zionist historians and the new historians or revisionist Israeli historians, a group that originally included Benny Morris, Ilan Pape, and myself. I'll only focus on one bone of contention in the debate, British policy towards the end of the inglorious end of the British mandate in Palestine. The old historians say Britain's aim was to prevent the emergence of a Jewish state. The new historians, led by Ilan Pape, argue that Britain accepted the inevitable emergence of a Jewish state. Its aim was to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. The key to British policy was Greater Transjordan, to support the bid by its client, King Abdullah of Jordan, for the Arab part of Palestine, for the West Bank. Abdallah was called in the Foreign Office Mr. Bevin's Little King, and one British official called him a born land grabber. He was, and so were the Zionists, and the 1948 war degenerated into a general land grab. The winners were the Zionists and Abdallah, who captured the West Bank and annexed it later to his kingdom. The losers were the Palestinians. Let me now skip 70 years and get to Theresa May. She's an unqualified supporter of Israel and probably the most pro-Israeli leader in Europe today. May gave an address to the conservative Friends of Israel soon after she became Prime Minister. The entire cabinet and over 80% of Tory backbenchers belonged to the conservative Friends of Israel. She described Israel as a remarkable country, a thriving democracy, a beacon of tolerance, an engine of enterprise, and an example for the rest of the world. She spoke of Israel as a country where people of all religions and sexualities are free and equal in the eyes of the law. If I had to give a title to her talk, I would call it Theresa in Wonderland. May reminded her audience that Britain was entering a special time, the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, and she went on to deliver her wholly one-sided verdict on this infamous document. It is one of the most important letters in history, she said. It demonstrates Britain's vital role in creating a homeland for the Jewish people. And it is an anniversary we will be marking with pride. No mention of the Palestinians or Britain's failure to protect their rights. Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has a different take to the Prime Minister. In 2014, in his biography of Churchill, Johnson wrote that the Balfour Declaration was bizarre, a tragically incoherent document, and an exquisite piece of Foreign Office Futurama. This is the only statement by our Foreign Secretary that I think displays sound judgment and historical insight. But in 2015, on a trip to Israel as Mayor of London, Boris Johnson hailed the Balfour Declaration as a great thing. Apparently, there is no limit to British duplicity. An unbroken thread of duplicity and skullduggery connects British foreign policy from Balfour to Boris. I must conclude this brief survey of Britain's record in Palestine over the last 100 years by saying that this record is shameful and indefensible. In Palestine, Britain empowered a small minority to start the systematic takeover of the country. Britain overfulfilled its promise to the Zionists. It promised to view with favor the establishment of a national home, but it ended up by helping them to achieve a state. And it allowed Palestinian rights to be compromised in the process. It's a sad story of double standards, broken promises, and betrayals from Balfour to May. Theresa May has accepted Lord Rothschild's invitation to a dinner in London this evening to celebrate the Balfour Declaration centenary. The other guest of honor is Benjamin Netanyahu. Jeremy Corbyn was invited but declined to take part. Funnily enough, Corbyn declined to take part in a celebration because he has the most consistent record of support for justice for the Palestinians. Funnily enough, I wasn't invited. and it may be sour grapes on my part, but I angrily reject Theresa May's claim that Britain should mark the anniversary with pride. There is nothing to be proud of. On the contrary, she and her government ought to hang their head in shame. Thank you.